Hey everybody, Rob here at eTrailer.com. Today we're going to be taking a look at the SumoSprings custom helper springs for the rear axle on our 2018 Newmar Bay Star. Now having a motorhome is a really nice thing. We can get our family and go on a trip, see a lot of places we haven't been before. But a lot of things that people don't talk about is the ride quality and the stability of a motorhome whenever you're driving it. Because let's face it, we got a lot of area for wind to catch, so we end up being a giant windscreen when we're driving down the road. Well, that ends up means we're getting pushed around, we're fighting the steering wheel, not to mention everybody in the back's getting tossed around too. Now that's where a suspension upgrade is going to help you out. It's going to stiffen up the suspension, so hopefully a lot of those problems are going to be alleviated and we can have a little bit more stability and not have such a death grip and be so nervous when we're driving. Especially if you have a lot of weight in the back. A lot of motorhomes have a bathroom, the bedroom, or possibly you're even towing a car behind there. That's a lot of strain, stress, and weight on the back end. So being able to support that and stiffen it up is really going to make our life a lot easier so we can actually enjoy our motorhome rather than dreading driving it. So before we put anything on, let's go ahead and take our motorhome out on the test course, do a baseline run to see how it handles and see how much of an improvement we get once we do put our parts on. As I come up to the slalom course, I'm going to be going to the course about 10 miles an hour just so we can try to keep a nice baseline number. As I start to go in and out of the turns, I can already feel a pretty good body roll going on, especially again in the back. It just feels like the motorhome wants to lean really hard and then turn, which makes me want to slow down and kind of take my time going in and out of the turns, which isn't a bad thing, but it just feels a little bit unstable, so I need to slow down. Now here when we get to the bumps course, I'm going to be going over the course no more than 5 miles an hour again to get that baseline reading. Now clearly there's going to be a bump when I go over it for the speed bumps, but these are a little bit rough. I can definitely feel as soon as the back end goes over it because it feels like it's wanting to resonate through the seat. Not to mention I kind of feel the back end wagging up and down after I get over the bump. So it's continuing to bounce after the bump. So again, I'm kind of having to slow down a little bit, pay attention to where I'm going and make sure the steering wheel doesn't move and try to keep it tracking in line because the back end bouncing up and down really isn't helping out with the stability of my motorhome. And on top of that, everything in the back, if not people, are getting tossed around too. So I just really wouldn't want to drive my motorhome like this for a long period of time because I would be exhausted by the time I get where I'm going. And even just going through the parking lot here with the uneven pavement, the few dips that are in here, is making a lot of noise in the back of my motorhome. And again, I can just feel every little bump resonating through the seat. It's not a horrible feeling, but I can feel every single one. And again, that'd be one of those things where I really want to have to deal with that for hours on end. But now that we ran through our baseline, we kind of did confirm all those problems that were going on. The bumpiness in the back, stuff getting kind of tossed around, and just the unstable feeling when we're driving our motorhome. So we have our baseline done, so we're going to go ahead and take our Newmar into the shop and get our parts installed. But at the same time, we realize that you're not going to have a lift at home. You're not going to be able to have really anything that's going to be big enough to lift your motorhome. So we're going to give you a few tips and tricks of how to get everything done without using a lift. To start out, we want to pull our motorhome to a nice flat level ground. And now I know a lot of you aren't going to have a jack big enough to raise it up, but we can use our leveling jacks to raise the back end up to where our tires barely come off the ground. Now I do suggest doing one side at a time so we have some stability from the other side of the tire, but we want to pull our tires off so we can get access right behind our brakes because we're going to have to be working right here in this area directly behind the tires on the frame. At this point we can grab our upper bracket, our spring, our lower bracket, and 3 3/8 flange bolts. Now on your spring, you're going to have the top section is going to have 4 threaded holes in it, and the bottom section is only going to have 1. So we'll know this is the top. I'm going to grab our bracket. Now it'll have kind of a little lip that curves up. You want to make sure that it is facing up and that these holes on the side of the little wings, those are going to be going down. So we'll line this up to wherever it meets up with 2 threaded holes. And then we'll take our 3/8 flange bolts, and for now we just want to get them loosely in place, make sure they're not cross-threading, and that they're going in easily. Now our spring is going to be sitting against the frame like this, so that curved section on top should be facing outward. The lower bracket here, this little hook section, is going to grab onto the U-bolt, and this large opening should be facing towards the front. So we'll flip our spring over. You can flip the bracket over. We'll line up the two holes and then take that third flange bolt and again just loosely get it in place. And this one we don't really want to crank down too much. We want enough maneuverability in that bracket that we can still move it. Now we're going to take the entire assembly. We're going to sit it right on top of our leaf spring pack. Now again, that center section towards the front should straddle the leaf spring so it kind of sits down around them. And that hook on the back here should grab onto the front U-bolt on your leaf springs right above the axle. Now at this point we're going to take a few measurements and make a few marks. If we follow the instructions, it's going to tell us to measure from the top of the frame, and we're going to come down 6 inches. So I'll measure down 6 inches, then I'm going to take my paint marker here. I'm just going to make a quick mark on either side of the spring assembly, really close to the bracket. Make a mark on the frame at 6 inches, move to the other side, do the same thing. Now the marks we just made on our frame, we need to have lined up with the lower holes in our bracket. Now obviously, since we lifted our vehicle by the frame, the suspension is hanging down, so we actually need to move the axle up and compress the suspension until we can get that mark as close as humanly possible to the lower hole in our bracket. Now what I found to be the easiest way to do that is if you get a floor jack and you come directly underneath the hub of your axle, you can just use the jack to lift it up and then periodically check to make sure that both sides are lining up properly. And again, you want to double check that each side is lined up and it's not sitting crooked. You may have to make a few little adjustments like this, but we want to get those marks as close as humanly possible to the marks on the frame. So now that we have our bracket all lined up, we need to drill out the lower holes on each side. Now we're also going to be drilling out the hole directly above that on each side. So you want to double check behind the frame, make sure there's nothing there, because you don't want to hit any lines, air lines, or anything else and cause any damage. Also, another quick tip is our final hole size is going to be about a 3/8 or maybe a little bit bigger so we can get a 3/8 bolt through. But I always suggest starting out with a rather small bit because it's easier to get through the thick frame with a small bit and then just open it up larger. So I'm going to come through, make my pilot hole in each one of those locations, and then we can come back and enlarge it at a full 3/8 size. Now a lot of times whenever you're drilling, that drill bit may catch the bracket. So once you have your pilot holes drilled out, you can actually remove the spring. Keep in mind you may need to lower the axle, but you might have enough room to sneak it out. But we'll just go back and enlarge those pilot holes to the full size of that 3/8 or just a little bit over a 3/8. Now that we have all the holes drilled out, position our spring back in place, and we'll use our jack to lift it back up to where it needs to be. So now we want to get the black bolts out of our kit, and we're going to pass them through the bracket and all the way through the frame to the other side. We'll do that in all 4 locations that we drilled out, and it should be good enough just to hold them for now while we get them all in position. You have to move the bracket just a bit, get everything to go through. But if you drilled your holes big enough and the spring didn't move on you, they should be able to fit through. Now on the back side of the frame, on each one of the bolts, we're going to be securing it with a 3/8 flange nut. Now, how you get these in place, there's clearly a few different options. We can just reach our hand behind the frame, and if you can reach and feel the nut, you want to get it securely started. Now, if you don't have enough room to reach with your hand behind there, you can crawl under the frame and do it from the inside. Just keep in mind, we did just get done drilling, so there's quite a bit of metal shavings under there, so you do want to be careful. With the upper bolts in place, if we come back down to the lower bracket, you'll notice we're going to have two square holes, one on the inside of the leaf spring and then one right towards the tire. I want to grab these long carriage bolts. We'll have a little square head underneath the rounded section and go through that hole. And I will let you know it is kind of a tight fit once you have the spring in place, but there is enough wiggle room, even if you just have to kind of grab the bolt and tap it down and get it past the spring itself until it drops down. You just want to make sure that that square engages the hole all the way and it isn't sitting there crooked. But if you are having a little bit of trouble, you can grab a hammer or whatever you need. Just give it a quick tap, they should fall down. Now in the bottom where our bolts are coming down through, we want to grab this bracket. It's going to have two holes in it, but if we look at it, it's going to kind of be of a U shape. You want to make sure that the flat section is facing up towards the leaf springs like this, and the U is facing down. So we'll line up our bolt holes, have the bolts pass through. We'll make sure both bolts go through the bracket. We'll lift it up against the leaf spring, just hold it in place. We'll take another one of those 3/8 flange nuts, and we're going to get it loosely installed on each one of the legs of those carriage bolts. Now right now, we just want to get them in there hand tight, just so that bracket will hold itself and not fall down. That's going to be all the hardware we need to get in place, so we can grab a 9/16 wrench and socket and start tightening everything up. Again, you're going to need to hold the bolt or the nut on the back side of the frame and use the other end to drive it. So I'm going to reach behind the frame, hold the nut while I tighten up the bolt on the front side. We're going to go through and repeat that for all the remaining hardware. Now, it may be easier if you do get an extra set of hands and have them hold the wrench for you. Now the top bolt's tight, we're going to come back to our lower bracket, and I suggest getting an extension. We can use that same 9/16 socket, and we're going to tighten up the nuts that are on our carriage bolts. Now I do suggest alternating, going back and forth between the two bolts. That way you know you're going to have an even clamping force, and it doesn't bind up when we tighten it up. Now, if you are keeping track, we still have 3 more bolts that we have to tighten up. You don't want to forget to tighten up that very bottom one. Luckily, there's a large opening here. You just take a wrench, a 9/16 wrench, and we'll tighten everything up. Make sure it's nice and snug. And then we're also going to have to tighten up the 2 on top. Now again, got plenty of room to get a wrench in there. And you may be able to get a socket since this section of the body kind of opens up once you get back here. But ratcheting wrench works really well. Plenty of room to get it tightened up. You just want to make sure you snug those 2 top bolts up as well. Now that everything is tight on this side, we're going to go ahead and lower the jack down. We can put our tires back on and then just repeat the exact same process on the other side. Now, one thing I do want to mention about the passenger side, all the brackets are going to look very similar, and they're actually going to be the same brackets. So on the passenger side, that little hook still needs to go on the forward U-bolt, but it's going to be on the outside towards the tire rather than on the inside. Now, one final thing you do want to double check once you have all your wheels and tires back on and the weight of the motorhome is back on the ground, you want to double check these carriage bolts and make sure that the nut in this lower bracket is nice and firmly against the bottom of the leaf springs. Because of the way the suspension is going to move, once we have the weight on it, it may actually take up a little bit of space and make these bolts loose. And this is what I was talking about. You can see we've got the tires back in place, motorhome's back on the ground. But you see, once that suspension started moving, these bolts didn't loosen up, but there was a gap that was made between the bracket. So we want to make sure that we come back to that 9/16 socket and tighten up each one of these nuts, and also verify that the lower bracket is still straddling the leaf spring and that it's wrapping around the U-bolt. But now that the springs are installed, we can take a closer look. Now these are going to provide us with a nice smooth ride and give us the support we need in the back of our motorhome by mounting directly to the frame and on top of our leaf springs. That way it's going to limit the amount of travel that we have. So if we have a slide out, a bathroom, maybe we're flat towing our vehicle behind our motorhome, that puts a lot of weight back here, so it's going to prevent that back end from sagging down. And since it's made out of a microcellular urethane, it's also going to absorb a lot of those road shocks and bumps, so we can have a nice smooth ride at the same time. We're going to have one spring on each side of our axle, so they're going to work independent from each other, which is going to be really nice because it's going to cut down on that body sway, or if we're driving down the highway and a big gust of wind comes along, it's not going to allow the back end to start swaying and moving back and forth a whole lot because it's going to have all that support here. So if we do take a turn, one side is going to compress while this side will stretch out, but they're also going to be trying to fight each other, so try to keep it nice and level. Now, one of my favorite parts about our spring is the fact that once we have them in, we can forget about them. They're going to be completely maintenance free. Unlike some of the other suspension upgrades like airbags, those are going to be a little bit more intensive to put in, and we are going to have to monitor them. We're going to have to worry about the air lines not getting damaged, along with making sure we maintain correct air pressure in the back. So these are just going to be really nice because once they're in, we can just enjoy our motorhome and be on our way. I know a lot of you looking at this may think that this is going to give you a stiff ride just because of the fact that it's not going to allow the suspension to move. But that's the nice thing about our SumoSprings. They're going to have a progressive rate to them. So if we have no extra weight or very little weight in the back, our springs are going to compress softly and engage at a nice soft rate. But the more weight and the harder they get pressed on, the stiffer they're going to become and the more support they're going to give us. So we're not going to have to worry about having a harsh ride because it is going to absorb a lot of those bumps and engage softly unless it needs to provide us that support. Now also, you might be wondering, well, that's extremely close to the brakes and the frame here, but that's the nice thing about these. When they compress, they're not going to expand too much to the side, so we don't have to worry about our tires, brake lines, or anything else that's around here interfering with our springs. Also, I know a lot of people like to take their motorhomes up in the mountains, take a trip through the mountains, and it gets extremely cold. Or if you go down to the desert, it's going to get extremely hot. Well, that's another nice thing about our springs. We're not going to have to worry about any kind of environmental issues messing with them because they are going to be resistant to most UV rays, oils, and automotive chemicals, and they're going to work from negative 25 degrees Fahrenheit all the way up to 200 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, our SumoSprings are going to provide us with 5,400 pounds of load leveling support. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to add that much to the payload of your vehicle, so you do want to double check your owner's manual and never exceed the maximum towing capacity of your motorhome. But I know the big question is going to be is how well do they work? So we're going to go ahead and put our tires back on. We'll take it on our test course and see how they improved everything. I'm going to come back to my slalom course and I'm going to try to do about that 10 miles an hour again as I go in and out of the turns, just so we can keep it as clear and take out as many variables as possible. But just even driving up to the course, I can already notice a difference. Especially going in and out of the turns, it feels a lot more stable and it's reacting a lot more quickly. Don't get me wrong, it's not a sports car, but it's definitely a lot quicker to react. There's not as much body roll and not as much of that soft, mushy rolling feeling as I'm going in and out. As I come up to the bump course, I can already tell a difference. Don't get me wrong, clearly the speed bumps are still there. But what I really like about the way my motorhome's acting now is that as I go over the bumps, it's not a continuous bouncing feeling. It just kind of handles the bump, we have a little bit of a rebound, and we keep going. Whereas before, we were continuously bouncing before we even got to the next one. Now it's a lot softer of an engagement too. I don't have this jarring feeling shooting up the seat into my back. It's definitely a lot more manageable, and I can just relax a little bit. I don't feel like I had to have such a grip on the steering wheel. I can just go along the bumps and continue on my way. It's a lot more manageable, and I wouldn't have such a problem driving this for a long period of time now. And even just going through the parking lot with the uneven pavement and the little dips and bumps around here, it's a lot softer of an engagement. I mean, don't get me wrong, again, I can still tell that they're there, but it's not this jarring feeling shooting through the seat. It's just a lot more manageable, and it just seems to go along its way and not be bothered too much by it. So I think our springs made a very big improvement. Like I said, as I was going through our course, it really took away a lot of that body roll, softened up all the bumps, and just made it to where I could relax and actually enjoy driving the motorhome. Just keep in mind that is going to be the rear suspension. Now, if you're going to do the rear, I suggest that you do the front as well. That way we're going to have full stability from the front to the back of our motorhome. Not to mention, it's just going to make it a nicer ride. So if you do have somebody that's a little nervous about driving something this big, it will definitely make it a lot more manageable. But again, I'm Rob here at eTrailer.com, and that'll finish up your look and install of the SumoSprings rear Maxim helper springs on our 2018 Newmar Bay Star Motorhome.